At 2 a.m., the entire neighborhood surveillance system crashed in the middle of an active police chase and no one knew why until morning. The bank at the corner had just been robbed, but all external security footage was completely black. One by one, residents woke up to alerts. Garage doors wouldn't open, motion lights were frozen, and the main security feed had gone totally offline. Meanwhile, HOA President Karen was busy uploading selfies to social media, standing on my roof with a smile like she just saved the neighborhood from an alien invasion. Except the only thing she actually did was paint over my solar panels a beige latex paint, covering the panels that powered the entire grid, the very panels that fed the security system, the panels that protected every house from break-ins and disaster. She didn't just ruin my roof, she destroyed the neighborhood's only shield against the chaos beyond our gates. I was jolted awake by my backup system's frantic alerts telling me all primary lines were down. Stumbling to the server bank, I confirmed my worst fear. The solar input had dropped to 0. At first, I thought maybe a bird had fried itself again. It had happened before, but when I checked the roof cam, I blinked twice. There it was, solid, consistent, glossy beige paint covering every panel, fresh roller marks still visible. The footage was time-stamped just after midnight, and there she was, Karen, the culprit, wearing leopard print leggings, sunglasses at night, and a visor that looked like it came straight from a 1993 tennis catalog. Paint roller in one hand, stepladder in the other, humming what sounded like an opera remix while defacing my roof in the name of neighborhood beautification. This wasn't just vandalism, it was ignorance on steroids, so bold, so confidently executed, clearly from someone who believed she was untouchable. Karen had no idea those panels didn't just power my home's air conditioning or pool heater. 5 years ago, when break-ins surged, the HOA had quietly approved a contract to install a solar-powered security system, cameras, backup lights, motion sensors, encrypted storage, all running through hardware I designed and installed myself, cheaply, because unlike Karen, I actually cared about the community. I ran a quick scan, everything was down. The firewall held thanks to an off-grid battery, but the cameras, lights, motion alerts, all dead. My phone buzzed. 2 voicemails, one from Officer Grant asking for overnight footage, one from Mr. Delgado whose garage door refused to open. Then texts flooded in: lights not working, alarm stuck, a dog missing because an auto gate malfunctioned, a sprinkler system that sprayed non-stop for 3 hours. Meanwhile, Karen kept soaking up likes and hearts online, tagging the HOA with #neighborhood improvement and #better together. By sunrise, I was at her door. I wasn't angry yet, somewhere between disbelief and amused. She opened in a robe straight out of a 1950s detergent commercial, wearing a proud grin. Before I could speak, she raised a finger like a conductor about to cue the brass and said she was glad I came by. She wanted to talk about how my panels were an eyesore, clashing with the HOA-approved color palette, and how she'd taken it upon herself to enhance property values by neutralizing the visual pollution on my roof. She genuinely believed she'd done the right thing, like she was the neighborhood hero. I calmly told her those panels powered the entire surveillance grid. Her face twitched, but she laughed it off, claiming I was exaggerating and that they were just a few personal gadgets. I pulled up the footage of her painting, climbing the ladder, humming to herself like she was on an HGTV show. Her smile faded. Then came the classic Karen move: deny, deflect, attack. She claimed the HOA had never officially approved such a large-scale grid, and if it existed, it was illegal for me to run it without public documentation. I told her I had the signed contract, buried deep in old files, signed by the previous board. She smirked. Well, good luck finding it. That's when I realized she hadn't just painted the panels for aesthetics. She'd done it because she wanted control, because she'd found out what the system did and wanted it dead, so she could replace it with something she could manage, manipulate, and profit from. Just then, neighbors started showing up. Jack from 2 houses down, furious his daughter's security camera went offline overnight. Mrs. Lopez rushing over to say their garage door nearly crushed their car when it glitched. Within the hour, half the block was on my lawn. Karen stood red-faced but defiant, insisting she acted in the community's interest, protecting home values. and enforcing aesthetic standards. I didn't have the energy to argue. I told everyone to meet at the HOA building at 6 p.m. I'd bring proof. Then I went straight to my basement where I kept a physical archive of HOA contracts, security plans, and correspondence. Back when people still used paper, what I found sent a chill down my spine. The contract was gone. The whole folder, the space it occupied in my fireproof cabinet wasn't empty, it was filled with a typed letter, unsigned, stating the solar surveillance initiative had been cancelled and no longer fell under HOA protection. It looked official. But I hadn't written it, and I knew for a fact no one else had access to that cabinet unless someone broke in, unless someone wanted that system to go dark and made sure any paper trail tying it to the HOA vanished overnight. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Karen vandalizing my roof, it was about her covering something up, something much bigger, and I was going to find out what, because the real question wasn't why she painted the panels. The real question was, what did she not want the cameras to see? When I stepped out of my basement, the air felt different, heavier, like the calm before a storm only I could sense was coming. Neighbors still gathered outside, pacing, whispering, pointing at my painted-over roof and then down at their phones buzzing with system errors and frozen screens. Karen had retreated to her fortress of floral wallpaper and HOA trophies, but I knew this wasn't over, and not by a long shot. The question wasn't whether I could prove the panel's importance. It was how deep Karen's meddling went and who else had helped scrub the truth. I returned to my home office and opened an encrypted backup drive I hadn't touched in months. Years ago, after the system was built, paranoia had set in. I made sure every revision of every HOA security contract was scanned and stored digitally on multiple drives, each locked behind layered passwords. That paranoia paid off. I found the original file, the HOA agreement, scanned and time-stamped, digitally signed by every board member from 5 years ago. It detailed exactly what the system was for, how I was authorized to host it, and how the HOA agreed to monthly payments for maintenance. Those payments, of course, stopped the moment Karen took over. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just Karen being Karen. This was a long con. She bided her time, letting the old board phase out. She volunteered to run a finance subcommittee, then slowly wormed her way into HOA leadership. One by one, she isolated the old members. I remembered when the treasurer, a sweet retired librarian named Nora, suddenly moved away without notice. I'd always thought it strange how her departure coincided with tighter HOA rules, higher fines, and mysteriously delayed security payments. Now it made sense. Nora hadn't wanted to deal with Karen's growing dictatorship. I dug up my old emails and searched for Nora's last messages. At first, they were routine, payment confirmations and schedule updates, but her final message stood out as short, strange, sent late at night. Dev, if things start going dark, trust what you built. Don't let them rewrite the truth. You'll know what to do. I read it twice, then again. It wasn't paranoia, it was a warning. She knew what was coming. She knew someone was going to try and erase everything. At that point, I needed more than proof. I needed a witness, someone from the original board still in town. I remembered Phil, the former vice president who'd lived just 3 streets over. He left the board after a public fight with Karen at a community cookout. Something about a landscaping bill she tried to double charge. I found his number in an old contact sheet and called him. No answer. I tried again. This time, he picked up. His voice was low, guarded, like someone who hears the storm long before it hits. He remembered me. He remembered the solar deal. When I told him the panels had been painted over, he swore under his breath and said he wasn't surprised. Karen had campaigned for months before officially taking over. She wanted a new image for the community and thought the security system made people feel unsafe because it projected fear. She pitched the idea that visible cameras and panels made the neighborhood look like a prison compound, that people would feel safer if they didn't see any security at all. Classic Karen logic. Remove the protection to create the illusion of peace. Phil agreed to meet me before the whole meeting. He said he still had some old files, too. If I brought my evidence and he brought his, we'd have more than enough to shut her down. I thanked him and got to work. I printed the documents, backed them up on 3 separate drives, and uploaded key points to a secure cloud account. Then I turned to the neighborhood group chat, usually a cesspool of recipe swaps and lawnmower complaints, and dropped a calm but powerful message. Tonight's home meeting will include proof of fraud, sabotage, and abuse of power. Please attend if you care about your home's security. No shouting, no drama, just the truth. The message spread like wildfire. By afternoon, my doorbell rang. It was Mr. Delgado and his teenage son. The older man looked tired, the kid, red-eyed and frustrated. Their security alarm had failed overnight, and the son's car had been broken into. Nothing major stolen, just tools and an old stereo, but it was enough to remind them why the system existed in the first place. I explained everything of the panels, the footage, the erased contract. Delgado shook his head slowly, like someone betrayed by a friend. Then he asked if he could help. I gave him copies of the documents and asked him to keep them safe. Then I did the same with Jack next door. By evening, half a dozen homes had pieces of the truth. No matter what Karen tried, she couldn't silence all of us. The meeting that night was at the community center. Usually, home meetings drew about 15 people. That night, the room was packed. Folding chairs were dragged from closets, and people stood against the walls. Karen strutted in 10 minutes late, wearing a blazer that practically screamed authority, clutching a thick binder, enough to choke a horse. She smiled, waved, and thanked everyone for coming to hear about her beautification updates. She kicked off the meeting with a slideshow before and after pictures of trimmed hedges, neutral tones, and herself smiling proudly in front of various houses. Then came the photo of my roof. Karen standing before the beige-painted panels, arms wide as if she'd just cleaned the Sistine Chapel. I didn't interrupt. I waited. Let her build her fantasy. Let her dig her own hole. She even claimed, without a hint of irony, that she'd taken initiative to remove unauthorized installations that were causing neighborhood stress. Then she opened the floor for questions. I stood calmly, holding a small remote, walked to the front, plugged in my drive, and played the footage. The room fell silent. Karen's roller paused, her humming stopped, her muttering about symmetry faded. Her little joke to herself is that they'd thank her when the place looked like a resort died on her lips. Next, I projected the original contract across the screen for everyone to see. I highlighted her signature, the dates, the payment agreement. She tried to interrupt, claiming the documents were fabricated, that I'd altered them, that the footage was deepfake. But then Phil walked in late, but not too late, with a box in his arms filled with paper documents, signed minutes, original vote records. He passed them around, and Karen's face drained from fire engine red to chalk white. Murmurs rose around the room. Then Mr. Wheeler, the retired judge who usually slept through these meetings, stood up and called for a formal vote of inquiry. The room erupted in agreement. Karen tried to shut them down, but she was drowning in a sea of evidence and fury. By the end of the night, she wasn't in charge anymore. Not officially, but I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't over, not for her. She hadn't just lost control as she'd been exposed, and I had a feeling she'd do anything to get it back. That night after the meeting, I didn't sleep. The victory felt hollow, unfinished, like I'd just cut off one head of a hydra and more were ready to grow. Karen had been humiliated, sure, but something about her silence as she left the room stuck with me. She hadn't thrown a tantrum, hadn't screamed or threatened. She just stared a cold, calculating like a gambler who knows they've only lost the first hand. That quiet confidence wasn't accidental. It meant she still had something up her sleeve. I couldn't afford to wait for her to play it. I started reviewing the neighborhood security architecture again. The main solar-powered array was dead, obviously. The backup grid was functional but limited to emergency zones only. I'd built redundancy into the system but not to account for sabotage. Still, I'd kept one thing secret. A hidden node. A tiny, isolated feed running through a dummy panel disguised as an attic vent. It didn't power anything but it recorded everything. I hadn't even mentioned it in the original design specs. It was my insurance. A last resort black box. I accessed the node and rewound the feed not just to the moment she painted the panels, but to the hours before. What I found wasn't just Karen on the ladder. It was her pacing between her car and a storage shed near the HOA office. The shed had been locked for years, supposedly used only for holiday decorations and folding tables. But she was hauling boxes into it. Not one or two but 10, maybe 15 large, heavy boxes. The way she struggled, even with a dolly, told me these weren't filled with fake pumpkins. I enhanced the footage and caught a glimpse of a small black symbol on the side of one box before she turned. A barcode and an abbreviation I recognized. It was from a security vendor, the same vendor the HOA had contracted me to work with for surveillance tech, half a decade ago. There was no reason for Karen to have that equipment unless she was planning to set up her own system. That was the only explanation that made sense. She wanted control, and not just over appearances, but over data, over what people saw, what they didn't, who got flagged and who got ignored. A system she could manipulate, tailor, maybe even monetize. I pulled the vendor records from my files. The company hadn't received an order from the HOA in years, but there was a recent bulk purchase just 2 months ago under a different name I didn't recognize. The delivery address matched the community center. I knew I had to see inside that shed, but the HOA office and its grounds were under lock and key. Worse, after last night, I suspected Karen would double down on protecting her secret. I needed help, and I needed someone who wouldn't blink at the word illegal. So I called Joel, a former classmate, now a cybersecurity contractor with a side gig in digital locksmithing. He owed me a favor, and I knew he'd find breaking into a suburban storage shed beneath him, which was exactly why he'd say yes. I told Joel I needed eyes and access. He asked one question: does it involve Karen? When I said yes, he laughed and said, give him an hour. That evening, under the cover of dusk, we approached the shed. Joel had already hacked into the community Wi-Fi. The moment we parked, he held up a tablet showing a live feed from the office's front-facing cameras. He looped the footage with old recordings from the night before, giving us a clear window of time. The shed was secured with a digital padlock and a thumbprint scanner. Joel pulled out a tiny scanner of his own, pressed it to the reader, and ran an override script. The lock clicked open in under 20 seconds. Inside, it wasn't decorations, it was equipment. Racks of uninstalled cameras, signal boosters, a hardwired server hub. Karen wasn't just planning to replace the system, she was already halfway through building a private one she hadn't told the board about, one funded by money that wasn't accounted for in the HOA budget report. Joel ran a scan and found the server already had test footage stored. It had been active quietly, without permission. He pulled the most recent clip and played it. What we saw made my stomach drop. A hidden camera feed from inside someone's backyard. Not mine, not Joel's. The Thompsons, their young daughter playing by the pool. The camera angle was invasive, mounted high enough to see into their windows. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. The folder held dozens of similar clips. Karen had been spying on neighbors, recording them without their knowledge, without consent, without legal clearance. And she'd stored the footage on a private, unregistered system. Joel's voice was quiet but sharp. This isn't HOA business. This is criminal. He began downloading the entire drive. We wore gloves, took photos, cataloged everything. We didn't touch a single item. When we left, we locked the shed exactly as we found it. But I knew we couldn't sit on this. Karen hadn't just overstepped, she'd broken the law. More importantly, she'd violated the privacy of every person in this neighborhood. That gave me leverage. It wasn't just about restoring the solar panels anymore. It was about exposing everything she'd done. I compiled the files into a report, a summary, video stills, timestamped logs, purchase receipts. I didn't send it to the HOA board. I sent it to the county compliance office and the local district attorney's office. I didn't name myself. I submitted it anonymously, but I made sure to copy the package and prepare a second version. That one I planned to present to the residents directly. I didn't want Karen fired quietly. I wanted her held accountably in front of every family she spied on, every neighbor she lied to, every person she manipulated. By morning, I had confirmation. The DA's office had received the package. An officer from the compliance board contacted me personally after tracing the footage back to my original solar system layout. He asked if I'd be willing to give a full statement in person. I said yes. Then, just as I was about to hang up, he said something that confirmed everything I feared. They'd been investigating Karen for months. I wasn't the first to file a complaint. I was just the first with real proof. Now it wasn't a question of whether she'd retaliate. It was when and how hard. Karen had spent years building her little empire of beige fences and power plays. She wasn't going to watch it burn without throwing everything she had left into the fire. I'd uncovered the start of her surveillance scheme, but I was certain there was more, much more. And if I didn't find it first, she would, and she'd make sure I disappeared with it. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers and sideways glances. Something had shifted. It wasn't just about painted panels or the fried security system anymore. People could feel it, the tension sharp as static before a lightning strike. Karen had always ruled with an iron clipboard and fake smiles, but now she was quieter, more deliberate. She wasn't hiding, and not exactly, but she wasn't making her usual rounds either. No morning walks, no surprise inspections, no curtain-peeking surveillance, which meant she knew something was coming, and I had no doubt she was preparing for it. The only thing more dangerous than a petty tyrant is a petty tyrant backed into a corner, especially one who believes she's the rightful queen of a suburban kingdom. I knew she wouldn't go down without a spectacle, so I had to get ahead of it. The footage from her secret surveillance system was already in the hands of the DA and the county board. That was good, but it wasn't enough, because even if the law came for her, she'd twist the story, flip the narrative, drag me down with it. She'd already started. That morning, flyers were posted on neighborhood gates, cheaply printed smear sheets accusing me of hacking the HOA system, misusing private data, and illegally spying on residents for personal profit. The wording was clever, technically vague but emotionally loaded. She didn't sign her name, of course, but we all knew where it came from. And the worst part? Some people believed it, not because they trusted her more, because fear spreads faster than truth. I saw it in my neighbor's eyes, the hesitation, the quiet suspicion. I couldn't blame them. If someone told me a resident had built a secret surveillance network and had footage of kids playing in their yards, I'd panic too. Karen had flipped the narrative, turned her crimes into mild-edged sins. I had proof, but she had fear. And right now, fear was winning. I called an emergency community meeting that night. No HOA permission, just a gathering. I printed every piece of evidence I had: photos of the shed, footage stills, inventory lists, system logs. I even got Joel to record a video statement verifying the equipment's existence and its connection to the unauthorized feed. We used to work with law enforcement, so he knew exactly how to frame it without stepping into legal quicksand. I wasn't going to wait for authorities to roll in weeks from now, after their slow-moving wheels finished grinding. This had to be public. It had to be immediate. By 7 o'clock, the community center was full again. The community center was standing room only. Word had spread faster than I expected. Even people who never showed up, older couples who usually kept to themselves, families who traveled often, teenagers who usually stayed out of HOA drama, were there. Karen was there too, sitting dead center in the front row like a queen about to watch a bad jester perform. Her expression was unreadably calm, composed, hands folded in her lap like she had nothing to fear. I didn't start with accusations. I began with a confession. I explained the solar grid, how it had been approved years ago, how it had silently protected the neighborhood, how I'd kept it running even after funding stopped. I described how I'd discovered the sabotage of the painted panels, the shutdown. I walked them through the legal documents, the signed contract. Then I revealed the secret server. I made no guesses. I stuck to facts. When, where, what. Then I showed the footage, and not the most invasive clips, just enough to make the point. Driveways, backyards, private fences, cameras placed without knowledge or consent. I showed timestamps, equipment ID numbers, the vendor purchase links, all tied back to the HOA account and the storage shed under Karen's key. The room was silent. Some people gasped quietly. A few stood, clearly disturbed. Karen didn't move, didn't blink, but I saw her throat tense. Then she stood and asked if she could speak. I told her this wasn't a trial, and no one here was judge or jury, just neighbors. She stepped up anyway. She spoke calmly, deliberately, saying she'd only intended to upgrade neighborhood protection, that my system was outdated, unreliable, undocumented. She claimed I had refused to cooperate with modernization efforts, leaving security gaps that put everyone at risk. Her temporary system was meant to fill those gaps. She said she had no idea some test cameras were accidentally recording private areas. She planned to notify the board before going live. It was a good performance, measured, emotional, and vague enough to plant doubt. But this time, she didn't have control. People had already seen too much. A mom stood and asked how Karen could call it modernization when it was done in secret. A retired vet asked why none of the board had been informed if the system was so vital. A teenager raised his hand and asked, right in front of everyone, why one of the cameras had been pointed at his sister's bedroom window. That question shut the room down. A dead silent. Karen's composure cracked just for a second. Her smile faltered. She started to speak again, but no one was listening anymore. Someone called for a vote, not official, just a show of hands. Do we trust Karen to continue as president of the HOA? Not a single hand went up. Another vote. Should a formal request be submitted for county intervention and oversight? Every hand went up. Karen turned and left the room without a word. No one stopped her. No one looked her in the eye. Outside, as the crowd slowly dispersed, I stood on the steps, letting the cold air bite through my shirt. Phil came over and clapped me on the back. He said he hadn't seen the community come together like that in years. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the unease. Karen had lost this round, yes, but she still had access to whatever else she'd built. And if she'd gone this far, who knew what else she'd hidden? The shed was just one piece. The painted panels, the secret server, those were bold moves. But they were also distractions. If she was willing to frame me and risk federal violations, it meant there was something bigger. That night, I received an anonymous email. No subject, no text, just an attachment, a screenshot. It was from inside my house. Not a camera I installed. The angle was wrong, tucked behind a shelf, aimed at my office desk. I felt my blood run cold. The timestamp was from earlier that week, before the home meeting, before I exposed anything. Karen hadn't just been watching the neighborhood, she'd been watching me, which meant the game wasn't over. It had just entered a far darker level, and I was done playing defense. The image burned into my brain like a hot brand. My own office, my own desk, my private space violated by a lens I never installed. I checked every crevice, every bookshelf, every piece of tech in the room. There it was, tucked behind the molding of the bookshelf, a tiny camera, barely larger than a paperclip, wireless, battery-operated, perfectly positioned to catch everything I did at my desk. Karen hadn't just sabotaged the neighborhood, she'd invaded my home. Not metaphorically, not politically, literally. She'd crossed into criminal territory without hesitation, like she had nothing to lose and everything to gain. That was the final push. I wasn't going to let her fade into the background and scheme her way back to power. This wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could manipulate, lie, and intimidate their way into control over other people's lives. I called Officer Grant from the sheriff's office and asked for an immediate visit. I didn't mention the camera in the email. I didn't want to tip Karen off through any system she might still have running. When Grant arrived and saw the footage, the emails, and the camera itself, his expression shifted from polite concern to professional urgency. He made 2 calls while still in my house, one to a judge, one to the county cybercrimes division. Within 48 hours, a warrant was approved to seize the contents of the HOA office, Karen's personal laptop, and the entire digital infrastructure hidden in the community storage shed. Karen tried to resist at first. She claimed it was all a setup as some male neighbor trying to destroy a successful woman out of jealousy, but the camera in my house sealed it. There was no HOA jurisdiction that could justify planting surveillance equipment inside a resident's private home. The police searched her house. They found not only blueprints for hidden cameras but also drafts of scripts she planned to use at future home meetings to spin narratives about multiple residents. She had folders labeled by address. Mine was labeled Rogue Engineer. One folder was titled Election Insurance. Inside was a detailed strategy to install sympathetic HOA board members by threatening code violations and offering to waive them in exchange for votes. She had created a shadow government under the HOA's Banra system, not just of surveillance, but of. She had planned to use the footage to manipulate, blackmailing people, spinning stories, crushing opposition, and even profiting from third-party security companies she quietly invested in. It was a level of corruption no one expected from the woman whose biggest claim to fame had been winning Best Lawn in 2019. The county board acted quickly. Within a week, she was formally charged with multiple counts: illegal surveillance, fraud, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds. But even with her gone, the damage lingered. People didn't trust each other like they used to. Neighbors kept their curtains drawn tighter, their doors locked earlier. I couldn't blame them. Still, something remarkable happened after her fall. The community began to rebuild, and not just the security grid, but the spirit of trust and cooperation that had been suffocated under her rule. Phil was appointed interim HOA president. Several old board members returned, including Nora, who came back from Florida after hearing what had happened. She told me she never really wanted to leave, but Karen had threatened to report her for mishandling funds. A lie, of course, but one that had scared her into silence. I helped train,